Hey guys, and welcome back to another Conan Exiles video. Today we are in the Corner of Bones, building the Star Fort. This was quite a long build, so it will, of course, indeed be a speed build. So, without further ado, let's get started. As with all my speed builds, I'll walk you through my ideas and concepts behind the build, along with my architectural choices and any difficulties that happened along the way. Afterwards, we'll be walking through the finished build when the construction phase is complete. For this build I do indeed have a blueprint which you can see on screen now. The design of the outer walls is very simple in terms of layout, though the inner building is quite complex. This build is pretty massive too, so if you're wanting to build this without admin permissions you will need a ton of resources. This build was inspired by a suggestion from Torn, one of my patrons and long-term viewers on the channel. He suggested a Vauban style star fort. This design takes its name from a French military engineer named Sebastian Vauban. Born in 1633 and dying in 1707, he worked under King Louis XIV and is generally considered as the greatest engineer of his time, and perhaps one of the most important engineers in Western military history. His fortification principles were used for almost a century, and his offensive tactics remained in use until the mid-1900s. His influence can still be seen in civilian infrastructure in France, most notably the Canal de la Birche. One of his most recognisable contributions to military fortification designs is of course his Star Fort, which is still in use as late as 2020 in some French bases in Africa. The shape of the fort is designed for practicality, allowing for defenders to fire on the flanks of attacking ground troops, whilst also offering them absolutely no cover. Given the advent of modern military firepower, these forts aren't really that practical in most real-life military scenarios anymore, save for the sightline and cover advantages. They're used in Africa due to the fact that they're probably going to be fighting insurgents, which likely don't have access to tanks, artillery or planes. However, these forts were designed to defend against infantry and early gunpowder cannons, not airstrikes, tanks and artillery shells. However, that doesn't detract from the beauty of Vauban's designs, and his original Pentagon-style star designs have been adapted for a more decorative and stylistic purpose, which is more what I'm aiming for in this build. However, I will definitely be considering using the more traditional design in a future build. When it came to the construction of this build, I went for a 6-pointed star, aiming for a more decorative design rather than practicality, though these walls will still offer a decent defensive option. The angles of cover are still reduced, though this design does introduce a couple of dead zones underneath each tower. I built each arm 8 tiles long, connected them together, and then constructed the second stage circular foundations at each point of the star. When it came to the interior baseplate, this was much more complex. If you're a little bit OCD at times like me, you can draw lines on the interior with square foundations to meet in a central circle, and then remove those 2 lines and begin on the interior baseplate, knowing that it's perfectly centred. However, if you would rather just eyeball it, you can do that pretty easily by starting with the back tiles at roughly 2 tiles away from the rear wall. At its core, the central baseplate is a series of circular foundations linked together with some rectangular and square attachments. It is pretty difficult to build though. I built it myself and I still struggle with the design, so I'd recommend either screenshotting the blueprint from earlier in the video or looking at the full-size blueprint link I will leave in the description below. When it came to my material choices, I had a few solid options. Initially, I of course wanted to use Arena, which would lend itself very nicely to this design. However, Arena would have just turned into a massive mess of brown bricks, so I wanted to create some really good separation in the colour and material palette. Therefore, for the outer defensive walls, I went with a material choice of Yamatai and Black Ice, and Yamatai entirely on the interior building. The contrasting tones will really help to differentiate the material just enough to create some solid definition on the outer wall, and the full Yamatai keep within the star should be defined enough by the various roofs and room verticality that it won't all just mesh into one massive lump of white walls. The exterior walls will end up quite simple in design, but with the keep inside I'll be using the multi-circle design to be able to raise core parts of the build up, whilst keeping some of the extended sections lowered to aid in breaking up any real structural monotony that might occur. I'll also be raising towers up from the roof, all height adjusted around a large central tower, which will lend itself better to the overall shape of the build. Whilst the build itself is complex, the base plate is symmetrical, which helps in building a well-balanced design, and I think the overall complexity of the interior keep works well with the attractive simplicity of the exterior star-shaped walls. For decoration, I ended up melding a few different styles together. I tried to include a lot of plants and flowers to breathe some life into the build, along with plenty of Khitan tapestries and statues to help introduce some elements of culture into the design. I'll be using Aquilonian statues on the exterior and star walls, mainly because they're quite big and intimidating, and tonally they match the Yamatai walls quite nicely. And inside I'll be using some smaller Khitan legionary statues within the bedrooms and rest areas. To keep this build practical, most of the ground floor will be dedicated to important workshops for crafting, resource processing and equipment maintenance. The rear of the ground floor will include a kitchen and a lounge, and the first floor is designed a bit more for comfort and social activity. So I think that covers all I have to say for this build. As usual, I'll be letting the rest of the construction phase run and then we'll walk through the finished build together. If you'd like to skip forward to the finished fort, you can do so by clicking the next chapter on the play bar below. So, with all that being said, enjoy the rest of the build, and I will see you in the furnishing phase. Finally, when the shallow build was done, it was then time to, of course, furnish. Approaching the build, I've decorated the exterior with statues and just some gentle lighting, and I've added pathways to the towers at each side of the entry gate. These towers offer paths to every other tower, which also connects on the ground level to the yard. Also, just to pre-warn you, this section will probably have some fairly hefty frame drops at certain points. This build is massive and it takes up a lot of processing power, and really, I couldn't do anything to counteract it, so it is what it is, I'm afraid. Within the internal yard, I've included a couple of utilities I couldn't quite squeeze into the interior keep. On the left side of the yard is an altar to Yogg, which surprisingly fit quite nicely into this gap. You could probably squeeze an altar to Mitra, Set, or maybe Ymir into the same space, though you would probably struggle with something like Zath. I also included 2 small animal pens on the back side of the build. Not as ideal as the large animal pens, but it still offers 2 spots for your animals. Entering the central keep, the ground floor is the main workshop area, where all of the crafting and important activities would take place. On the left side is an earthen workroom, where wood, bricks and hides can be crafted and processed. On the right is the metalwork, where of course metal can be smelted and smithed into a wide variety of items. Behind those rooms are 2 smaller workshops. On the right side is the delving room. Decorating the delving room proved pretty difficult, so I tried to use the shape of the room to aid the decoration rather than oversaturating the room with placeable items. I also did add a casting table to this room, as I couldn't quite fit it into the metalwork area. On the left is the alchemy lab for crafting potions and salves. At the back of the ground floor is where the build begins its transition into more social spaces. On the left side is a decently sized kitchen with all the available utilities, and on the right side is a smallish lounge area adorned with an Elk King trophy and various flowers and vases, perfect for relaxing with the boys after a hard dungeon run. Heading upstairs, we reach the more comfortable areas of the build. In each of the side towers, there is a small rest area with some benches and a small bedroom area next door for 2 people. In the centre of this floor is also a meeting room for planning future trips around the exiled lands, and on the left side is another rest area and bedroom, the same as the right. In total, this build sleeps 4 people, but it could easily be adapted to sleep 8. Heading up to the roof, I've added even more relaxation and seating areas. I haven't added too much to the roof. I initially was going to, but I changed my mind, as I wanted it to be a place where you can take in the environment and the exterior wall design. And there we have it, the Star Fort in the Exiled Lands in the Corner of Bones. Thanks for watching. I had never really considered building a star-shaped fort before Torn made this suggestion, but having looked into the history of Vauban's designs, I'm really quite pleased with this build. I do really have a soft spot for medieval architecture, and reading up about it was really interesting. Putting it into this build, I'm really pleased with how it came out, and I'm definitely going to build another design in the future that is more focused on defensibility and military might. As always, you'll find all the links to my Twitch, Discord, Twitter, Patreon and NordVPN discounts in the description below, along with credit for the music used in this video. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. I put out at least 2 videos a week, so there's always plenty of content to come. If you have any suggestions for future builds, I would love to hear them in the comments below. As always, a massive thanks to our patrons Dialot, Randar, Connor, Blue Ivy, Velma, Torn, Eagle Rose and Maril224. Again, thank you very much for watching, take care, and I'll see you soon.